in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas. And that's not University of Michigan or Michigan State University. But I think we're going to forgive her because she's given a lifetime of public service to our country and to better relations in this hemisphere. So it's my pleasure to present to you the Deputy Assistant Secretary for North America, Rachel Pointer. Rachel, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ambassador Blanchard. Can everyone hear me okay? And I hope that you can forgive me for my background at University of Texas at Austin, but I will tell you that my son, who is in the middle of applying for college admission, is definitely looking up north, in case that helps. I want to give you a sense today of the breadth and the depth of the bilateral relationship, and it is truly a pleasure to be with all of you today at the Canada-United States Law Institute's 46th Annual Conference. As Ambassador Blanchard noted, I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for North America in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs here at the Department of State. Thank you for welcoming me to speak about U.S. policy priorities for this really important bilateral relationship. I'm so pleased you had the opportunity to hear directly from our terrific ambassador, David Cohen, this morning. And I hope my remarks can really give you a sense of just how deep the relationship is and from the Washington perspective. The theme for this year is supply chain challenges for North America. And as Ambassador Cohen indicated, I'll nest that theme today in an overview of the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership. But first, I'd really like to start with a broad overview of why the U.S.-Canada bilateral relationship is so very important. Then I'll talk about how we at the State Department are working to strengthen that relationship, and then finally open the floor for questions. I can say without exaggeration that the past year or so has been one of the very busiest in U.S.-Canada relations. President Biden's first virtual meeting with a foreign leader was with Prime Minister Trudeau on February 23rd, 2021, the same day they announced the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership. A few days later, Secretary Blinken took his first virtual trips to Canada and Mexico. And during those virtual meetings, our leaders set us on a path of renewed friendship and partnership as we tackle some of the most pressing issues facing our country and the world today. The list is daunting: a global pandemic, economic upheaval, supply chain disruptions, a deepening climate emergency, growing rivalry with the People's Republic of China, a technological revolution that is reshaping every aspect of our lives, and most recently, Russia's premeditated and unprovoked war against the sovereign nation of Ukraine and its people. We're certainly living in a time of unprecedented challenges, but also unmatched opportunity. In addition to addressing these challenges, we're also advancing our shared values with a particular focus on global alliances, democracy, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion. Under the leadership of President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, our countries are working together to meet these challenges and advance our shared national interests. Now, let me get into an overview of the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership. The roadmap lists the bilateral priorities that President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau have jointly committed to. And I know that Ambassador Cohen gave you a sense this morning of those key pillars within the roadmap. So what I'm going to do is give you some detail about those pillars. First, combating COVID-19. Our top priority is the health and security of our citizens. And we're doing what we can to address new variants, follow expert advice, and support global, affordable access to vaccines. You all know better than most, the United States and Canada share a 5,525-mile border that sees approximately $1.7 billion in bilateral trade each day. The border is now open to all fully vaccinated travelers. We have worked closely with the Canadian government throughout the pandemic to facilitate travel across our shared border and to minimize supply chain disruptions. Our intention is to ensure the health and safety of our citizens while enabling the flow of goods and people between our countries. So that we're ready to face the next pandemic and to continue to work on this pandemic and other health threats, the United States and Canada joined Mexico in pledging to re-envision and update a plan that we created over a decade ago, our North American Plan for Animal and Pandemic Influenza. I also want to acknowledge in this realm the unfortunate exacerbation of the opioid crisis, the rise in drug use and overdoses in both our countries in the wake of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. Our office here at the Department of State helps to implement the U.S.-Canada Action Plan on Opioids, which addresses the epidemic from law enforcement, border security, and public health perspectives. Now looking at building back better, which I know Ambassador Cohen mentioned this morning. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has had devastating economic effects. In our bilateral roadmap, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau agreed on a vision for a sustainable and key here, inclusive economic recovery that strengthens the middle class and ensures people have good jobs and careers on both sides of the border. They also recognized the opportunity for clean growth driven by workers, communities, businesses, and innovation. We want to make sure that we're driving a robust economic recovery that benefits everyone. President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau underscored the need to build back better together in a way that addresses the disproportionate effects of the pandemic on women, youth, underrepresented groups, and Indigenous peoples. Our governments are working together to allocate resources to support women, minority, and Indigenous-owned small and medium-sized enterprises, as these are the backbone of our economy. For instance, we're working to better connect small business development centers and minority business development centers in the United States with their counterparts in Canada to ensure the sharing of networks and best practices. The supply chain disruptions that we've seen during the pandemic have emphasized the importance of working with allies to ensure resilient supply chains in strategic areas. President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau committed to creating a bilateral supply chain working group, which was launched December 13 in Ottawa by our NSC, the National Security Council, and counterpart agencies. The working group covers 7 sectors: critical minerals, electric vehicles and batteries, information and communications technology, including semiconductors, public health, medical devices and personal protective equipment, defense, solar, transportation, and logistics. As you can see, there's a lot for our 2 countries to talk about. The working group builds upon the U.S.-Canada Joint Action Plan for Critical Minerals, which is an effort that I chair here in the Department of State with my counterpart agencies and our Canadian counterpart agencies. It's a whole of government approach to strengthen our supply chain for critical minerals that are crucial to our mutual defense, strategic industries, and energy transformation. While the PRC is our largest supplier for many of these minerals, our engagement with Canada builds on our relationship with a reliable supplier that respects market principles and advocates for transparent mining governance right here in North America. And it's certainly a hope that we'll begin processing the majority of our mineral output closer to home instead of relying on the PRC. I'd now like to talk a bit about accelerating our climate ambitions. Addressing climate change is a core priority for both of our countries. President Biden understands the critical role the United States has to play in the global climate effort, and the administration has wasted no time re-engaging the global community on this shared challenge. President Biden announced the U.S. plan to achieve a 50 to 52% reduction from 2000 levels in economy-wide net greenhouse gas pollution in 2030. And we certainly recognize and applaud Prime Minister Trudeau's leadership and commitment for Canada to reduce emissions 40 to 45% by 2030. Our 2 countries have worked together closely, including in the advance of the COP26 in Glasgow and afterwards, to urge countries to align climate targets with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. For example, we cooperate on taking action to reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, such as methane, via the Global Methane Pledge. We truly appreciate Canada's leadership in this area, including at the Major Economies Forum Ministerial, where Canada proposed a goal of 50% of new light-duty vehicle sales in 2030 to be met with zero emissions vehicles, really recognizing the transformation that needs to occur in that sector. Our government agencies continue to discuss a broad range of technical issues related to the climate crisis, including the clean energy transition and carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The United States and Canada, as I mentioned, share the world's longest peaceful border, 40% of which is water. Our two countries enjoy 20% of the world's surface freshwater resources and cooperate in the management of the lakes and rivers that shape our regional environment and economy. The Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 established the Binational International Joint Commission to advise our two governments, and this includes recommendations on water quality and water flow in transboundary waters. And that commission continues to provide expert advice for us, our two countries. Our Bureau also leads negotiations with Canada to modernize the Columbia River Treaty regime, which provides the region with renewable hydropower and flood risk resilience, especially in the face of climate change. We are also seeking opportunities to strengthen environmental cooperation in the basin. Next on the roadmap, we can't be credible advocates for democracy and human rights abroad if we are not demonstrating our commitment to them at home. President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau share a strong commitment to combat systemic racism, unconscious bias, gender-based discrimination, barriers for persons with disabilities, and all other forms of discrimination and inclusion. To that end, our leaders are directing our governments to modernize approaches to community safety and address systemic racism and discrimination, including through meaningful engagement with civil society and community leaders. Our embassy and our consulates are facilitating cross-border information sharing and collaboration to help both countries ensure women's participation in a post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And I do believe Ambassador Cohen mentioned this morning. In the United States, we're taking a whole of government approach to apply a much needed diversity and inclusion lens to assess all of our policymaking. No conversation about US-Canada relations would be complete without acknowledgement of our highly integrated partnership on defense and security. The United States and Canada are long-standing allies. Our military leaders have met regularly since 1940 through the bilateral Permanent Joint Board on Defense. Both bilaterally and through NATO and other multilateral platforms, our countries cooperate on many of the most pressing regional and global issues facing the international community. Our close coordination on security is particularly critical during times such as these, when an unpredictable Russia is further destabilizing global security, with clear implications for the collective security of Canada and the United States, and for our allies and partners in Europe and elsewhere. We appreciate Canada's role as the framework nation in charge of a battalion-sized battle group in Latvia and a contributor of hundreds of troops there as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence through Operation Reassurance. NATO's enhanced forward presence in Poland and the Baltics is an important component of NATO's deterrence and defense posture in the eastern parts of Alliance territory, and ensures that our commitment to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty remains ironclad. We also appreciate Canada's many contributions of lethal and non-lethal military assistance, humanitarian aid, and budgetary help to Ukraine, both before and since the outbreak of Russia's unprovoked war. As our coordination on foreign policy, humanitarian aid, and sanctions against Russia demonstrates, our close bilateral relationship allows us to better leverage all of our instruments of national power, not just the military, in service of our shared interest. Speaking of shared interests, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau have affirmed that our collective security is a shared responsibility, and that we must invest in modern, ready, and capable forces in line with commitments to NATO under the 2014 Wales Summit Defense Investment Pledge. At NORAD, Americans and Canadians stand watch side by side, jointly conducting aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning in defense of North America. NORAD is the crown jewel of US-Canada defense cooperation. After 60 years in operation, it remains the only binational military command in the world. But as threats evolve, NORAD needs to evolve with them. The Prime Minister and the President share the view that modernizing NORAD is critical to defending our countries now and in the future. Last year's August 14 joint statement on NORAD modernization between our defense ministers defined many of our priorities for this process. In the months since then, the urgency to fulfill our leaders' intent to modernize NORAD has only increased. Canada's decision to negotiate the purchase of 88 F-35 fighter aircraft is a step in this direction. The last section of the roadmap signals our recommitment to work with our partners to find multilateral solutions. President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau affirmed their shared dedication to addressing global challenges and reiterated their firm commitment to the United Nations, the G7, and the G20, as well as to NATO, the World Trade Organization, and the Five Eyes Partnership. And in November of last year, President Biden met with Prime Minister Trudeau and President Lopez Obrador at the North American Leaders Summit for a trilateral discussion. That conversation focused on three pillars: ending COVID-19 and advancing global health, fostering North American competitiveness, and creating conditions for equitable growth, as well as addressing irregular migration. Since then, our three countries have met several times and at various levels to advance these goals, with an aim to make significant progress by the half-year mark since the summit on May 18th. We also look forward to working very closely with Canada and other partners in our hemisphere at the 9th Summit of the Americas in June in Los Angeles. We're also working closely to align our approaches to the challenges the PRC presents to our collective interest and to the international rules-based order. This includes pushing back against the PRC's coercive and unfair economic practices, national security challenges, and human rights abuses, while cooperating with China on areas where it is in our interest, such as on climate change. Our close partnership with Canada includes humanitarian issues as well. After the United States military completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, Canada quickly offered to resettle 40,000 vulnerable Afghans. Of those, at least 5,000 may be Afghans whom the United States directly refers to Canada for resettlement based on agreed parameters. We are also closely coordinating bilaterally and among other allies and partners on how we can best support Afghans in Afghanistan. Earlier, I mentioned our ongoing coordination regarding the unfolding humanitarian disaster that Russia is causing in Ukraine. To borrow a phrase from Secretary Blinken, our alliances are force multipliers. They're our unique asset. We get so much more done with them than we could without them. There's truly no better example of this than with the close alliance we share with Canada. This close alliance between Canada and the United States, as I've indicated through my remarks, is incredibly deep. It's incredibly broad. At this point, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions regarding the U.S.-Canada relationship.
Questions? People are taking their time with this very thoughtful series of remarks that you gave us. So, yes, there's a question. Larry Harvard.
Thank you very much, Lawrence Herman from Toronto. Thank you very much for that very thorough review of the relationship. You talked about all of the good things, all of the positive things, which we all appreciate. But there are some challenges and difficulties and bumps in the road. And some of those bumps are higher than others. Can you talk about what you see as the challenges in continuing the relationship on a positive trend, and what might impact the unfolding of the roadmap that you talked about? We'd like to hear about where the difficulties are, as well as where the bright spots are.
Thank you very much for that. I know that Ambassador Cohen talked this morning about how deep our partnership is and noted that it's unlike any other in that it covers trade, treaties, cooperation on defense, global cooperation, but it also is about our connection through families, through neighboring communities. There is bound to be differences of opinion at times in such a close partnership. And of course, you know that the government of Canada has raised several concerns with us, particularly relevant as you all talk about supply chains today. So as we look at concerns, for instance, that may be on some of our provisions, for instance, on Buy America, or on tax credits for electric vehicles, I think the key here is to note that we are deeply committed, as President Biden indicated to Prime Minister Trudeau when they met in November, to that conversation and ensuring that we find a good path forward for our two countries and that we make sure we understand Canadians' concerns on issues like this, and particularly in that trade realm. And I think key to this is ensuring that we handle disagreements just as well as we handle agreements. And I know Ambassador Cohen indicated that this morning. And it's ensuring that we have a good line of communication, which we do with the government of Canada at all times.
Larry, a follow-up. Okay.
Yeah. What I'd be interested in knowing is, in the broader context, in the geopolitical context, leave aside softwood lumber and all of the, if you like, parochial issues that Canada tends to raise with the United States. Let's talk about global issues. Where do you see Canada improving its position or playing a better role in a global context? The United States is a global power. What do you look to from Canada? What do you look to when you look at Canada? And where do you see areas where Canada, in a global sense, in a geopolitical sense, taking into account the war in Ukraine, could do a better job in supporting the United States as a global power?
I think one of the things that I would stress is that we welcome increases in defense spending that get our NATO allies closer to our pledged goal of 2% of GDP. We certainly welcome an increase in that area. And I think our two countries working together, talking together, and making sure that there is a Canadian robust package of NORAD modernization to ensure an adequate defense of the entire North American continent, but also to ensure that we have that commitment for our NATO allies. We certainly are focused in that area. And I think we, again, deeply acknowledge and respect the leadership that Canada has shown, and certainly will continue to work with them on Russia, Ukraine right now, as we look at the range of tools that we are utilizing to address Russia's unprovoked and unprecedented war. And certainly we have been in lockstep with our Canadian colleagues as we look at the various tools, including sanctions and aid to Ukraine.
Diane Francis. Should be on.
I don't think it's on. Okay, there, now it's on. Two things, Canada's lack of defense preparedness in the Arctic. I would like you to comment on that. I know that there was an agreement reached in the fall that the Americans would essentially take over all the surveillance, and the British offered to patrol submarines in the Arctic because Canada doesn't. Number one. Number two, Line 5, the controversy concerning Line 5.
Thank you very much for that. We were very pleased that we were able to finally convene a dialogue with our Canadian counterparts on the Arctic. This is something that, as you note, is incredibly important to us, but across the entire range of issues, economic and security as well. And so again, as we think about defense modernization and NORAD modernization, of course, issues in the Arctic are front and center for both of our countries. And I think that is certainly one area that we want to continue the conversation with Canada on, with a particular emphasis of how we address security and economic issues, as well as inclusion when we look at the communities in the Arctic, and make sure that we are very forward-leaning given what we are seeing right now vis-a-vis Russia and concerning trends. On the issue of Line 5, on October 4, Canada invoked the negotiation phase of the dispute resolution provision of the bilateral 1977 Transit Pipelines Treaty. Both parties have engaged in very constructive discussions and recognize the great importance of this matter for both countries and our bilateral relationship. Because Canada invoked that dispute resolution provision of the treaty, discussions on this issue between our two countries are being conducted through legal channels. And I don't believe at this point a date for the next negotiation session has been set, although they have met twice at this point. And I'll leave it there, but mainly with the statement that Canada remains a key U.S. partner in energy trade and in our joint efforts to tackle the climate crisis and protect the environment. So we look forward to continuing to work with Canada on this particular issue as well.
Christopher Sands.
Hi, Rachel. Chris Sands here. Nice to see you on a screen again. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about another process that you're involved in, and that's the North American Leaders Summit. And the roadmap is sort of a bilateral thing that nests in a trilateral conversation. Can you talk a little bit about Mexico, how Mexico is contributing to Canada-US relations and this North American agenda? And maybe for an audience that focuses on Canada, the US, what's your outlook for Mexico as a partner in many of these same areas that you've outlined?
Thanks very much for that question, Chris. Really appreciate that. I think that as we look at what we do in each of our bilateral relationships, there's so many synergies. And the North American Leaders Summit that occurred in November offered an opportunity for our three leaders to really talk about where those synergies are. And of course, the issue of North American competitiveness and supply chains is key to that. So I'll give you some examples of where there's some really nice overlap and bilateral work that feeds into a trilateral component. Canada and the US has really taken some leadership in terms of our governments working on and creating a supply chain working group, recognizing that we need to have input from the private sector very much about what it is that the governments can do to ensure resiliency and to guard against disruptions, and making sure we know what the priorities are from the private sector. That provided a nice model for us to also do a working group on supply chains also with Mexico. And the notion is that both of those bilateral efforts, of course, tie into how we look at North American competitiveness and the trilateral notion, of course, of supply chains as we look at chains that go up and down our three countries. That's one example. When we look at COVID-19 and recovery efforts, there's a real need for us, for all three governments to think about this area and what it is, including on supply chain disruptions that we saw during the pandemic, but also how we get out ahead and how we make sure that we guard against some of the disruptions that we saw. Are there things that we can do in a trilateral sense? And that there's a really great conversation happening among all three governments right now that is very much aligned with what we see in the bilateral roadmap, as well as in our bilateral efforts with Mexico. For instance, with Mexico, we have a high-level economic dialogue that focuses also on some of these issues. To me, there's a lot of synergies here. I'll also note that there was absolute agreement that all three countries should be looking at what we can do in the diversity and inclusion space and ensuring that as we assess North American policies, we're doing our best to address those issues, particularly because on both borders, we have Indigenous tribes that straddle the border, and it's important for us to think about these issues together as well. with our Mexican colleagues. I would be remiss if I didn't note that we are absolutely tracking what is occurring or what has previously just in the last few weeks occurred in Mexico on some of those energy reforms. And we are watching closely along with our Canadian colleagues about possible impacts for us in that space.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that outstanding presentation. It's been an honor to have you give us your remarks today. We're glad that you're there in Washington. Wait, do we have one
Sorry, I
more
have one more
question? Sorry,
question.
one more
Sorry.
question. Okay.
Sorry, it took me a
Yeah,
bit to get up.
yeah.
And it's a little bit of a change of topic, but I know that the United States is hosting the Council of the Americas later this year in June. And I'm just wondering, especially as we look at the forces that affect migration from the South America into North America, if there are ways that you are looking to speak to Canada on how Canada and the United States can work together to kind of mitigate some of those pressures.
Thank you so much for that question. And that is absolutely a topic that is front and center for us in this Bureau and for the administration. And we have had a terrific conversation with Canada specifically on the issue of irregular migration in our hemisphere. As you all know, we're seeing unprecedented flows in the hemisphere, part of which are a result of what the hemisphere has been through with COVID-19. And the pressures that we're seeing worldwide for many vulnerable populations. Canada has been a tremendous partner when we look at the issue of migration, including migration flows in the hemisphere. And we are absolutely having a good conversation with Canada and with Mexico about possible ways that we can address these issues. Of course, it is first and foremost, as you know, imperative that we think about the drivers of migration. And for us, we have a strategy that's focused on some of the root causes of migration in the hemisphere, and particularly from Central America. And Canada is talking with us and with Mexico about how they can work with us in addressing the root causes of migration. In addition, when we look at some of our collaborative migration management strategy here in the United States, we're looking at things like labor pathways. And so we have had a good conversation with Canada as well about how they may be able to work with us and with Mexico. And certainly there are deliverables on migration specifically about migration within the North American Leaders Summit. And so it provides a nice avenue for us to have this conversation trilaterally as well as bilaterally with our Canadian colleagues.
Great. Well, Deputy Assistant Secretary Rachel Pointer, thank you very much for being part of our conference. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we're going to take a break now, and we will resume our program starting with our third panel at 1:30 p.m. So back in your seats at 1:30. Thank you.